So let's move now to our panel, and each person is going to speak up here, and then we will congregate on the stage and have a conversation. Our first presenter is Xiaoru Shirley Lin, who has affiliations with both the University of Virginia and the Chinese University of Hong Kong. She's also a very good friend, and it's always nice to have her here at Brookings, whether she's speaking or anything else. So Shirley.
Thank you very much, Richard. Ambassador and my fellow panelists, David Abraham and Ryan. It's a privilege and honor to be back, and thank you for the opportunity to share my views on challenges facing Taiwan's economy since I was here a year ago, and how the Tsai administration is addressing those issues. I take the risk of doing something a little bit unusual. I think my fellow panelists wouldn't be boring you with the long-term vision of the economy, but I thought it deserves a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes, to talk about what Taiwan's really caught in, and it's something that is rather difficult for any administration to solve. Taiwan is, along with many other of its neighbors, caught in what I call the high-income trap. There are increasing economic grievances, and specific groups of people are experiencing a loss of identity and anger against the political and business elites. The consequence of this high-income trap, as I call it, is that there is rising support for extreme political leaders and extreme options, including protectionism and mercantilism, all around the world in other advanced economies, too. There are two reinforcing trends of economic malaise and political polarization, which is putting great pressure on the Tsai administration and producing high levels of uncertainties for leaders in Taiwan in all arenas. Let's examine how Taiwan is caught in this trap relative to its neighbors. So you can see here, there's Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Without going into details, everyone knows how growth has declined. Most interestingly, last year, everybody hovered around 2%. Now, these economies moved from middle income trap. Out of 101 middle income economies in the 60s, only 13 moved into the high income. But they're all caught in this trap now. While they were able to maintain high growth, often double-digit, even in the 80s sometimes, during that transition, they rely on high value-added exports. Their growth rates have begun to slow down, and all five are growing much slower, with other problems that are very important for political leaders. Wages have stagnated, and their manufacturing industries can no longer compete with lower base countries like China. As a result, they cannot provide the same benefits to a wide spectrum of society, and they've become increasingly reliant on China as a solution. This slowdown is, of course, accompanied by something even more difficult to resolve, and that is rising inequality. I think we're missing a slide here. Yes, okay. Rising inequality. These economies experience an economic miracle that decades earlier, because the growth was accompanied by reducing inequality. Here you can see here, China is the most unequal and advanced the most rapidly in its Gini coefficient. The triangle shows you 2000 level, and the orange bar is current level. The blue is 1980. And Hong Kong is the most unequal society among OECD economies. So Taiwan and South Korea and Japan, you say, doesn't look so bad. Well, there are many ways to look at this, and Gini coefficient is not really the gold standard, if you will, to measure inequality. For example, Korea's income inequality is the worst in Asia Pacific, according to the IMF, and top 10% of the population receives 45% of the income. Taiwan's top 20% household is 6 times that of the bottom 20%. It used to be at 4 times. This relativity is very important in terms of how the social stability is threatened. The growth in inequality is fueled by something also very important, and that is asset inflation, especially in housing. So you see here this chart, which was released about a month ago. Hong Kong is the worst. What this chart shows you is if you buy a house, a medium price flat with cash, in Hong Kong, it would take you 18 years without spending any money to save up to buy a medium-sized housing in Hong Kong, you can imagine, is nothing but very basic shelter. Taipei is very bad too, at 15.5 times. Taiwan as average, of course, there's a difference between city and rural. Taiwan on average is 9.3 years. Now, there is also a generational divide. When you look at this, most assets are held by the older generation. The younger generation are living at home longer than ever before, just like the United States. Youth unemployment is double that of the regular unemployment. In Korea, it's 3 times. Youth unemployment is 3 times as bad as average unemployment. I have a chart on unemployment, but here you are. So you can see the youth unemployment differential among generations. With high unemployment and sky-high housing prices, young people are getting married later and not having children. And with retirees living longer than before, you can see what this is happening. The pressure on the economy is tremendous. The population is aging, and it places burden on welfare entitlement, which is something that President Tsai wanted to tackle right on. So in France, just for comparison, you can see the average age here. It's aging very, very rapidly. Just for a comparison, France, the mean age is 41, US 38, China 37, Nigeria is 18. So how can Taiwan compete with these middle-income countries? Younger, more vibrant, more open as they catch up. And what are the ramifications of these economic problems? Well, Taiwan has a dilemma that it has to resolve to escape the high-income trap. Let's look at Tsai Ing-wen's effort to solve some of these long-term structural problems. First of all, to lift overall competitiveness and growth, Tsai has initiated a 5+2 industrial innovation plan. The first 5 were the Internet of Things, or Asia, Silicon Valley, biomedical, green energy, smart machinery, and defense. 2 were added later, higher value agriculture and the circular economy. The program later expanded to include the digital economy and cultural innovation, even semiconductor and IC design. So the list goes on. The 5+2 is really 5 plus infinity. And it's, to me, a very big fiscal stimulus plan. I believe these are important plans which will lift the growth rate by an estimated 0.2% for next year and the year after, GDP estimate. But to what extent can these initiatives solve the structural issues I talked about earlier? Well, I think what is commendable is to focus on the positive. The intention is correct. It is to move away from manufacturing and hardware. In other words, 1.0 to 2.0, or 2.5, to services and software. But the strategy is difficult and questionable. Let me talk about the area I'm most familiar with as a previous venture capitalist and banker. So Asia Silicon Valley involves creating a startup culture in Taoyuan, which is near the airport, which will require changes in the primary, secondary, and tertiary education system, attract foreign talent, capital, clean up the listing market to create more liquidity and transparency. And as you all know, the public markets in Taiwan are full of irregularities. The plan is also to balance regional development. So there is something for Tainan, something for Taichung, and something for Taoyuan, and something for Taipei. And this may or may not rebalance the economy, but some have accused the government of favoritism in this kind of allocation. And of course, most importantly, real estate plans never creates innovation, has never done so in the past. Further example is what the ambassador had talked about, defense. This is a sector the government has talked about committing NT 500 billion to an indigenous submarine and trainer program without joint venture in order to create jobs and to make Taiwan more self-reliant. But bolstering defense, including boosting morale and technology, is a worthwhile and necessary goal for Taiwan. But can Taiwan really produce the needed trainers and submarines for self-use and even export them? As the ambassador said, are these strategies the right strategies to meet the requirement of an asymmetrical warfare? Another fiscal stimulus initiative, the 100 billion forward-looking infrastructure plan, is perhaps even more of a fiscal stimulus plan. Investments will be made in rail transportation, waterworks, urban and rural development, and digital development and green energy. These efforts will hopefully create 40 to 50,000 jobs and make the environment more child-friendly. A total of 82 billion NT will be invested over 8 years. GDP growth will be adjusted upward as well as a result of the infrastructure plan. Next, to reduce welfare burden on the younger generation, Tsai has used a lot, the majority of her political capital in these 2 years to push through pension reform, something very controversial, costly as well to her. This is remarkable and important because retirement funds for private sector and retired servicemen will run out in 2027 and 2020 respectively. Current pension liabilities of the government stand at around $600 billion US dollars, and according to The Economist, or 9 times total annual expenditure. The reform will first affect 450,000 retired public officials and military personnel. The new law will reduce the 18% preferential return on pension payment to civil servants, including teachers, over time. You could imagine the controversy this has created. Young people support this reform in majority, but the execution has been painful, communication poorly carried out, and the result today is what you see, in that there is not a lot of appreciation for her tackling this issue. Recent tax reform announced by the Ministry of Finance simplifies the tax system to be more in line with international tax system, is a big step forward for Taiwan. However, many say it will only increase inequality. If you look at the details of the tax plan, there are lopsided benefits to the top taxpayers. What is notable is not what is not on the agenda. Problems such as wage stagnation is difficult to tackle, as industries are suffering already. Another poorly executed reform, which is well-intentioned, is labor reform, introducing a 5-day work plan, only to see backlash, not only from businesses who complain about lack of flexibility, increasing labor costs, as well as workers who say this will reduce their pay, because for one of the 2 days off, you're not allowed to ask people to overtime or pay them. So on youth unemployment, it's almost impossible to tackle without long-term changes to the education system. All the plans otherwise are simply short-term plans. There are too many universities providing too many unnecessary programs, training students that are not non-market-oriented skills, leaving students with no skills to compete domestically or internationally. Extensive consultation with civil society, businesses, and local political leaders is needed, and so far remains lacking. So, to come to the punchline, can China be a solution, or is it part of the problem? Taiwan has increasingly turned to China for trade and investment. From nothing across the Taiwan Strait in 1990, now China constitutes nearly a quarter of Taiwan's total imports and exports. This trade is founded on, of course, investments. And although in recent years, trade surplus has declined to under 30 billion in the last 2 years, from a high of over 40 billion, when you look at how China has grown as a trading partner, this was clearly at the expense of, this is investment, trade, and here we are. You can see China overtaking the US and Japan. And if you look at the number of tourists, Chinese tourists also have become the most important source of foreign visitors in volume, and then dropping by nearly 700,000 last year, only to be made up for by Japanese and Korean visitors. But this overall trend in drop of tourism continues this year. With China's recent effort to lead regionally and globally, China could potentially be an even bigger solution if Taiwan could benefit from One Belt, One Road, join the AIIB, or join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. But none of this is possible today. Or simply allow group tourists to return to Taiwan. For China to consider any of this, Tsai would have to accept the 92 consensus and acknowledge Taiwan is a part of China in some way. This is unlikely to happen because of how increasing reliance on China has turned an entire generation against all things Chinese. This rise of Taiwanese identity and a cautious approach to China remains on the island, and as China overtakes the US and Japan in terms of economic relations, Taiwanese are increasingly ambivalent and about deeper economic integration, and because of the threat China poses to Taiwan's security. So an alternative that we talked about is the new southbound policy. With a budget of $134 million to increase more social and business linkages with ASEAN, plus India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Australia, and New Zealand. We're kind of getting a lot of them in. In aggregate, these constitute the second largest export market and investment destination for Taiwan, Vietnam being the key destination. Total trade with the new southbound countries is 19% in 2016. As you can see, has been growing gradually. Total foreign direct investment in those countries amount to 91 billion. In some ways, the government is following the private sector, not leading it. As China has become overly costly, many Chinese companies and Taiwanese companies have moved from coastal cities in China to inland or to southbound countries, where the cost is lower, growth is higher, and the workers are younger. Therefore, there's a strong push by the private sector in Taiwan for the government to sign bilateral investment agreements with some of these countries. There is some 23% increase of tourists from these countries last year, and Taiwan hopes to see 2.2 million tourists by 2019. Having more Southeast Asian students study in Taiwan is a potential solution to Taiwan's demographic decline. But what is certain is that much of the investment is similar in nature to investing in China. Low-end manufacturing and services which will not upgrade Taiwan's competitiveness. Furthermore, most of these countries work very closely with China and will be reluctant to sign any agreement with Taiwan in fear of Beijing's pressure. So, to conclude, most important for Taiwan to exit the high-income trap and not overly rely on China is to work more closely with other advanced economies. Tsai has called for a Taiwan-UK free trade agreement, opening up the market for Japanese beef import, and send the second largest delegation after China to the most recent Invest US Summit. There has been a steady decline. Lost my page. There has been a steady decline in the bilateral trade relationship with the US, which is now only the third or fourth largest trading partner. Engaging with the US must be a priority for Taiwan. It needs to find common ground with the US through TIFA and sign an economic partnership agreement before the Fast Track Trade Act expires with a Republican Congress. Taiwan has to accommodate the US in terms of agricultural commodities, starting from industrial use, and mitigate impact on Taiwanese farmers who may be hurt. This will require political courage and will, but it is necessary for the ongoing negotiation under TIFA. On the US side, some compromises will be needed too. US has put forth a precondition that pork be liberalized before negotiations can continue, which precludes progress on other issues. Considering in 2015 a total trade of 29 billion, agricultural commodities was only 335 million, pork was only 30 million. Furthermore, on the investment side, Taiwan has the most potential for US to expand its services in Asia, especially in areas where US has competitive advantage. The US can invest more in service and technology and create jobs. The US trade deficit with Taiwan is only 1.8% of total trade, but the service trade surplus is 4.2 billion and can increase. Taiwan has offered excellent IPR protection and will welcome US investment over Chinese investment, that is for sure. But this will require Taiwan to liberalize in many ways. Taiwan has a lot of work to do to move into services and attract service foreign companies, and this is something I'm also deeply engaged in. Deregulation in finance is absolutely essential. Overregulation, low compliance have impeded Taipei's ability to compete with Hong Kong, Singapore, and Tokyo in banking, insurance, and securities. Overall, the economic problems of the trap may have solutions in the long run, but the second set of problems are more fundamental and harder to bridge because they relate to a deeper sense of community, values, and identity, specifically social justice, democracy, and freedom of speech. It is this difference in values and a lack of trust which makes deeper cooperation difficult between Taiwan and China, and makes deepening relationship with the US and Japan not only desirable, but much more plausible in trade, investment, to defense, and will further the values cherished by the Taiwanese people. So as it becomes more enmeshed in the high-income trap, Taiwan needs leadership which can be inclusive, not just represent the poor, the rich, the north, the south, the urban, the rural, or the young versus the old. They must also formulate and implement policies that can meet the socioeconomic challenges of today's Taiwan to solve long-term problems I have outlined, even if it's difficult in the short term. The most important task is to broaden Taiwan's economic relations with leading partners like the US in order to upgrade its value-added goods and services and remain dynamic and safeguard its way of life for the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shirley at least alluded to a lot of political dimensions of these problems of economic prosperity and economic policy, which provides a segue to our next speaker, David Brown, who's going to talk about Taiwan politics. So, Dave.
Richard, thank you very much before you depart. Don't know what this says about what he thinks I'm going to say. Anyways, it's my pleasure to be here. I just want to say I was very pleased by the substantive quality of Ambassador Moriarty's remarks. He was speaking for AIT. Even though he mentioned that I'm on the board, I have the privilege of speaking for myself, and please understand my remarks that way. As Richard said, my task was to talk, set the stage with respect to domestic politics in Taiwan during the past 18 months of President Tsai's administration. Taiwan's a democracy. It's, of course, looking to the future. And the future is a comprehensive local elections in the end of 2018, and then legislative and presidential elections in early 2020. And so I'd like to say a few words about how the main parties are preparing for that and look to that kind of future, and weld into it a little bit about each of the parties' handling of cross-strait relations as a domestic political issue. The DPP won such impressive sets of victory in the last two administrations that you might well have expected that the party to suffer from a lot of internal conflict. If you think of how Ma Ying-jeou's own administration suffered from internal differences, you can see that in a Chinese society with highly personalized politics, strong personalities within the DPP, a history of factions, that the party might well have begun to fracture as it looked to the future. That has not happened. Tsai Ing-wen has held the party together quite remarkably while dealing with a very complex series of domestic and international issues. She's just come out of a quite successful 30th anniversary DPP Party Congress. At that, she dealt, I thought, rather skillfully with a move widely supported within her party to pardon former President Chen Shui-bian. She deflected that by putting it off to the Central Standing Committee of the party, and was able at the conference to put in place the nomination procedures through which the party will choose its candidates for the local elections. So the DPP is going into these elections in a very strong position. It's hard to see how they can increase the overwhelmingly dominant position they have, but they're going into it well prepared. One of Tsai's biggest challenges has been to hold the party together behind her with respect to her policy for dealing with Beijing. And this has been a major challenge because she is caught in a trap. On one side, she has to deal with Beijing, which continues to press her to accept the 1992 consensus with respect to one China and deploy a whole series of quite draconian measures to press her in that direction. On the other hand, she has to deal with the deeper green elements within her own party, which are upset with her moderate approach to dealing with Beijing and want her, in the face of these hostile actions by Beijing, to move more in the direction of a sort of Taiwan independence approach to things. And she's had to steer her way between these two sets of pressures and maintain the party behind this policy that she laid out in her inaugural address, May 20th, 2016. And I think she's done a remarkably good job of that. Even before she was sworn in with president, at a time when the DPP was trying to show goodwill to China by advancing what is called the Cross-Strait Agreement Oversight Bill. The members of her own party were putting forward versions of this bill which were based on a two Chinas, or a one Taiwan, one China, two-state kind of approach. And she had to spend a considerable amount of capital to steer the party back to conceptualizing this as a cross-strait problem. And that has been the hallmark of her policy towards Taiwan, which was her commitment to handle cross-strait issues in keeping with the ROC Constitution and the cross-strait the statute for dealing with cross-strait issues. This issue just keeps coming to the fore. It came to the fore during the very successful Universiade Games in Taipei 2 months ago, when there was considerable pressure from within her own party for the Taiwan team delegation to go into the stadium carrying the ROC flag and not the Chinese Taipei Olympic flag. She had to, again, take a difficult position. She personally took this unpopular Chinese Taipei Olympic flag, handed it to the team leadership, and sent them off to the games. Not an easy thing to do. As soon as the games are over, an amendment to the Sports Act in Taiwan has to be passed, and members of her own party are urging that she drop the title Chinese Taipei Olympic Committee and substitute for it a term called the National Olympic Committee. And again, she has to deal with this pressure internally in order to maintain the centrist kind of policy towards Beijing that she's trying to deal with. This never stops. 2 weeks ago, a member of her own party put forward a constitutional amendment to write a two-states kind of provision into the ROC Constitution. And then at about the same time, her newly appointed premier stands up in the legislature and makes a statement that I'm a politician who supports Taiwan independence. She just has to deal with a remarkable series of pressures on this. Premier Lai's statement was out of keeping with her policy, and quite frankly, it was a surprise here in Washington, and the U.S.-Taiwan relationship thrives on a no surprises approach. So it's a two-way street, Garrett. I entirely agree with your comment. So the bottom line is I think she's done a remarkably good job in managing these things and keeping her administrations united behind a policy which she reiterated in her National Day address 3 days ago now. Now, does she get any credit from Beijing for taking all this heat domestically? No. Does she get credit at home? Well, her public opinion approval rating is quite low. The last time I looked, the TBS poll gave her a 29% approval rating and a 53% disapproval rating, which is a negative factor of 24. When that same organization polled right after her inauguration, she had a 29-point-plus rating. So her popularity at home has suffered, I would say, primarily because of things that have happened domestically, how she handled the work week issue, how she handled same-sex marriage, even though she took the initiative on indigenous people's rights. She got criticized for not being more forward-leaning on that. She took a great courage, as Shirley said, to put through the Pension Reform Act, and quite surprisingly, that gave her a slight bump up in her approval ratings. Then the economy had an electricity blackout, and down her ratings go again. So that's a little bit about President Tsai and the DPP. The KMT is also looking forward to an election, but they come with exactly the opposite background. That is, they suffered a humiliating set of defeats in the last local election and in the LY and presidential elections in 2016. Right after the election, the party was led briefly by Madam Hung Shu-ju. In May of this year, they had a new election for the chairmanship of the party. Woo Duan-yi, former vice president, a Taiwanese, won that election with 51% in a 5-candidate field. And he was seen as not as a broadly popular individual, but as someone who could sort of bring the party back to its roots and provide a stable base on which to move forward. In August, they had their party convention. All the various faction leaders within the KMT participated in that event, and the party adopted a new platform. And on the issues of cross-strait relations, the party moved back to positions that had been adopted under President Ma in endorsing One China with respective interpretations and Ma's 3 no's and so forth. In other words, they moved away from the rather pro-Beijing policies that Madam Hung had pursued while she was briefly the chairman of the party. And that, broadly speaking, moves the party back to the center of Taiwan politics with respect to these cross-strait issues, and therefore is a positive. But the party has lots of problems. It's still suffering under the legislation on ill-gotten gain party assets, and is literally still struggling month to month to pay its restricted or more shrunken payroll. Chairman Wu has his strong points, but he is a member of the older generation. He has very little appeal to young people. His base is very much within the KMT party. He's not very able to build bridges out to moderate voters. What the party needs at this time is new, younger leaders. And quite frankly, what I'm hearing is that Chairman Wu is more focused on putting in place people who will support his desire to be the KMT's candidate for president in 2020 than he is in trying to cultivate and bring up in a competitive environment young people who can provide future leadership of the party. So to sum up, the KMT is beginning to rebuild itself, but is not moving into these coming elections in a strong position. Just a few words about the third largest party in Taiwan, that is the New Power Party, or Shirley Lin. It came out of nowhere. I shouldn't say that entirely because its chairman, Wang Guochang, clearly came out of the Sunflower Student Movement when he was one of the most prominent leaders of it. But the party was born in 2015, competed in the 2016 elections, and emerged as Taiwan's third largest party. It's a party with basically 2 platforms. One is domestic reform agenda, and the other is a quite deep green approach to cross-strait relations. The party chairman, Mr. Wang, is quite popular within his own party, but the party as a whole is still struggling in the sort of mid to upper single digits in terms of support within the Taiwanese society. They are differentiating themselves from the DPP in part on these cross-strait issues. When the oversight bill was being considered 15 months ago, they had a 2-states approach to this bill. And when, as I said, this Sports Act came up after the Universiade Games, they were the ones who were championing the idea of having a national Olympic Committee passed into law with that device. So they are part of the problem that Tsai has to deal with in terms of managing internal opinion. One last thing not to forget is that in Taiwan there is a huge block of independent voters. In fact, the most recent polling I've seen out of the Election Studies Center says that in the last decade, the number of people who identify as independents has gone from about 40% up to almost 50% of the electorate. So these are an important factor in domestic politics, and this is one of the areas where Tsai Ing-wen has seen her support rate decline, is among the independent voters. The most prominent figure who represents the independence, you might say, or the independent element in Taiwan politics is Taipei Mayor Ko Wen-je. He came into office as an independent candidate supported by the DPP. His approval ratings were remarkably high at the beginning of his administration, and they declined in his first year in office. Two things I think have helped bring him back up. One was that the Universiade Games in August were universally seen as a tremendous success for Taiwan, and as the mayor of the city responsible for the Games, he saw his approval rating rise. The other thing is that he has had to deal with cross-strait relations too, because Taipei has a city-to-city, formalized city-to-city relationship with Shanghai. And so Mayor Ke, who comes from what I would call moderate green background, a pro-independence figure, had to find a way to preserve this forum and continue to have the PRC through the city of Shanghai participating in it. And he was able to do that. He worked out a series of languages and things he would say that were satisfactory for Beijing, but he did not have to explicitly endorse the 92 consensus or the idea of one China. And so he is seen as someone who has been quite successful in managing on a city-to-city basis his relations with this PRC. And with those remarks, I think I will thank you for your attention and take my seat.
Thank you very much, Dave. You've given us a really nuanced understanding of what's going on in Taiwan right now and the dynamics at play. We're going to shift to more U.S.-Taiwan relations, and our next speaker is Abe Denmark, who is the new director of the Asia program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Congratulations, Abe. He's also a senior fellow with the Kissinger Institute there. Before that, he was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia, so he knows whereof he speaks when he speaks to us on U.S.-Taiwan security relations. Please, Dave. Abe.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to Brookings for inviting me to speak. And thank you to Ambassador Moriarty, both for your remarks, but also for sticking to hear what we have to say as well. I wanted to focus most of my remarks in the limited time that we have on areas of change that I've seen in recent years in the U.S.-Taiwan military and security dynamic. But before I get into the change, I think it's important to identify areas of continuity. For almost 40 years, since 1979, the United States has been statutorily obligated to ensure that it retains the capability to defend Taiwan. This is different from a normal alliance treaty in which we pledge to defend a country. Rather, it commits us to maintaining the capability to defend Taiwan should our leadership decide to do so against aggression or coercion from the mainland. As one of the areas of change I'm going to be talking about is enhancing and deepening Chinese military capabilities. And often people will ask the question if the United States retains that capability. And I personally, speaking for myself, feel very confident yes, the United States does retain that capability, despite the remarkable advances that the PLA has made in recent years, which I'll get into later. So I think that's a very important area of continuity. The other being the very robust, if unofficial, security relationship that exists between the United States and Taiwan. When people talk about the robust relationship between the U.S. and Taiwan in this area, everybody always thinks about arms sales. And I think it's true that there's been a regular drumbeat across administrations for several years now of regular arms sales from the United States to Taiwan, again, as part of the Taiwan Relations Act to ensure that Taiwan has the ability to defend itself. But beyond that, there's the cooperation and engagement between the United States and Taiwan, if unofficial, in the security area remains very robust, if unappreciated. And that's been another area of continuity. And I think that speaks to an area of what I think is an undeniable fact that I think is important to talk about here. I expect Ryan will talk about it in his broader remarks after me, is that Taiwan represents an absolute value for the United States outside of the context of the United States and the PRC. That Taiwan is an important trading partner, is an important security partner. Taiwan plays a very important role in the world across many different issues, across many different areas, and that has not changed. And I think that's a very important basis for our broader relationship, including our military relationship. But again, I wanted to focus on areas of change in the last few years that I think are important to acknowledge, and broadly identified 5 areas. The first and most profound area of change has been the improving capability of the People's Liberation Army. For over 20 years, for decades, the PLA has received significant increases in its budget year to year, has been making very targeted and specific investments in a wide variety of capabilities across multiple domains in order to ensure that it has the ability to act in a variety of contingencies, but as has been reported for several years by the U.S. Department of Defense, it has been focused primarily on contingencies related to Taiwan, both to the ability to coerce Taiwan and the ability to take other action if necessary, but also to prevent the United States from intervening in such a contingency if the United States were to decide to. And as I said, these investments were very targeted in that, unlike the U.S. military, the PLA does not have to deal with global responsibilities against a wide variety of potential challenges across the spectrum of warfare, but rather has a very limited number of contingencies with a very limited number of potential challenges, and is therefore has been able to tailor its investments to very specific capabilities that are designed to, again, coerce potentially Taiwan, conduct other actions against Taiwan, and prevent the United States from intervening in such a contingency. And China has been reaping the benefits recently of these investments. These investments, again, have been going on for decades, and we're seeing a wide variety of benefits for the PLA as a result of these investments, from more advanced ballistic and cruise missiles to advanced aircraft, submarines, surface ships, capabilities in space and cyberspace. All the equipment has been improving remarkably, so that just a few decades ago, the PLA was described as an army of millet and rifles, excuse me, and now is one of the most advanced and one of the most capable military forces in the world. And it's also been, I think, more recently, and it deserves to be acknowledged, has also been taking a lot of organizational reforms under Xi Jinping, in which it adjusted from a large number of military regions into a smaller number of theater commands, adjusted its command structure to be much more of a Western style, as they put it, joint command structure, in which different pieces of the armed forces are theoretically at least integrated into a more joint capability. And as I like to point out, they do identify, the PLA does call this a Western style command structure. And I like to notice that when it comes to politics, when it comes to human rights, Western style is not acceptable. But when it comes to the military, absolutely fine, because it works. So that's an important area of change, and especially in the U.S.-Taiwan security area, is the incredible change in the PLA's capability, which is changing the military balance across the Taiwan Strait and giving China many more options across several domains than it had 10, 20 years ago. So that's the first area. The second area has been changing domestic politics, both in Taiwan and in China. It was mentioned before, changing domestic issues in Taiwan in terms of how people in Taiwan increasingly identify as Taiwanese and less as Chinese. Other polling suggesting a vast majorities of people in Taiwan continuing to support the status quo and not supporting either independence or unification, but rather being fairly comfortable with how things are now. Another important change with Taiwan that I think does not get acknowledged enough is efforts, especially by the Tsai Ing-wen administration, to increase the prestige of the Taiwan military. And I'll talk a bit about this later, but it's been very clear to me that President Tsai herself has been trying to increase the prestige of the military, trying to make it more attractive for young people to join the military in Taiwan, and both with financial but also more cultural initiatives in order to try to make it more attractive, try to increase its prestige in the society. And I think that's an important piece in terms of changing domestic politics in Taiwan. But there's also been, I think, a change in how the mainland has approached cross-strait issues in recent years, specifically on Xi Jinping's insistence on Tsai Ing-wen accepting the 92 consensus as a precondition for maintaining the degree of coordination, of connection that they had before. Which is ironic to me, since so much of China's foreign policy, China's domestic policy, especially U.S.-China relations as it relates to Taiwan, is based on ambiguity. If you look at the U.S.-China relationship, it's founded on ambiguity as it relates to Taiwan. And that goes for a wide variety of other issues in Chinese policy about China's claims in the South China Sea, a lot of issues in domestic policy. Ambiguity is central to that, and yet in this specific area, Xi Jinping has insisted on very specific clarity from Tsai Ing-wen. And in my estimation, Tsai Ing-wen has done everything that she could to demonstrate pragmatism, to try to get as close as she could considering her political base, and yet the mainland has not been willing to accept that. So I think those are important changes for where we are now. Third, I wanted to highlight some changes in Taiwan's military strategy and defense policy. As a caveat, there has been some continuity, and I'll get to that in a bit. But overall, I think there has been some important changes. So in terms of continuity in the defense strategy, if you look at the QDRs between 2013 and 2017, it does fundamentally retain emphasis on deterrence. The only change, though, is that in 2017 they added that it's deterrence across multiple domains. I mentioned before that the PLA has been modernizing across several different types of military power, different types of domains, and Taiwan's 2017 QDR acknowledged that deterrence requires deterrence across a wide variety of domains, that it's not just a one direction challenge. But beyond that, there has been important changes. It was mentioned earlier that Tsai Ing-wen has emphasized the domestic defense industry, both as a driver of indigenous technology development, but also as a way to increase employment as an economic driver. And that's been that's a new key part of Taiwan's defense strategy, is that domestic defense industry. The second area is that for the first time in Taiwan's QDR, they started pointing out specific weapon systems that Taiwan wanted to purchase, specifically pointing to the V-STOVL, which is a military acronym for vertical or short takeoff and vertical landing. It takes about a year in the Pentagon to learn that one. That also has stealth capabilities, and as far as I know, there's only one of those aircraft that in the West that has those capabilities. It's F-35B. Also pointing out diesel-electric submarines as a key capability of that. And so identifying so those are some, I think, the main changes in their defense strategy, still identifying hard rock as the key objective, preventing the PLA from being able to invade. And I'd say a slow acceptance, a gradual acceptance of the need for innovative and asymmetric capabilities. Taiwan has been investing in capabilities like that that are more survivable, that are more affordable, but also at the same time continuing to invest in, continuing to call for capabilities that are, I would say, are less asymmetric and less innovative, but are still quite costly. So the fifth area, in terms of change, has been in Taiwan's defense budget. And I do think it's important to identify the change and the nuances of that change. That Ing-wen announced, that the Tsai administration announced that next year's fiscal year defense budget, it would increase to 3% of GDP, at least according to plan. But if you look at the numbers, actually, it's not. It's a very it's a more complex story than that. That most of the increase in the numbers goes to personnel. In fact, if you look at the numbers, personnel increases are significant in the proposal for that budget, whereas money for equipment actually goes down a little bit, according to the proposal. Now, what happens to the LY and all that is a different story, but for now, that budget still remains flat. And I wanted to point out, Ambassador Moriarty mentioned Israel as a potential model for Taiwan's defense spending. Israel spends over 5% of its GDP on defense. And the other countries, he mentioned South Korea as well, also spend a very significant number. And I think that's right. I completely agree that if you look at the tremendous security challenge that Taiwan faces, that under 3% of spending, which is where they are now, is not enough to meet their defense needs. So I mentioned the 5 areas of change. I wanted to close by talking about 2 areas of uncertainty in the U.S.-Taiwan defense dynamic. First being China, and where China's policy is going to go. Everybody, as you know, in this audience, I'm sure, is watching what happens at the 19th Party Congress. There's a lot of focus on Xi Jinping's personal power and personal authority and how he may come out of this even stronger than he has been before, in terms of his ability to drive and shape Chinese policy across every issue area. And there's many who believe that with a freer hand, he may change approach on a wide variety of foreign policy issues, be it the United States, be it North Korea, and potentially even Taiwan. I haven't seen any indication either way. I think a lot of this is a bit speculative, but it's certainly an area of uncertainty about how post-Party Congress China may approach Taiwan, especially if they believe that the existing approach has not been successful to achieve their ends. And the second area of uncertainty, I'm sorry to say, in my estimation, has been the United States. Not in terms of the overall policy. I think President Trump, just before the inauguration and since, injected a great degree of uncertainty about the one China policy itself and what's actually open the air. But I think a lot of that has settled back into a fairly normal U.S. approach to cross-strait relations in the United States and Taiwan. I haven't seen any indication in several months that this is still an open question. But it did, I think, inject a greater degree of uncertainty about the United States into Taiwan and other countries across the region. Also, the United States withdrawal from TPP, without suggesting a replacement, has been another driver of uncertainty about the United States. I would add not just in Taiwan, but across East Asia. And to use parlance on other issues, it's not so much the repeal that's the problem, it's the lack of replacement that's been a driver of uncertainty about what we're going to do in terms of economic policy. And I think there's just a lot of thirst for knowledge, thirst for understanding what we're going to do on economic policy. If not TPP, then what? And third, in terms of concerns about the United States, is the, I'd say ever-present, but I think intensified now, fear of a grand bargain that the United States may strike with China. in that there's been reports flying around the internet, rumors about looking at, as mentioned, a fourth communique. People have been speculating about that. People speculating about what may happen when President Trump meets with President Xi in a few weeks. I'm not expecting any grand bargain in that way, but the idea that because President Trump is such an unpredictable figure, I've heard questions across the region about what may happen, what may be up in the air in terms of negotiations and conversations between the two presidents. And I think we can actually see that being reflected in some documents coming out of Taiwan. So I'd point to the QDR. I mentioned that before, and this is where I'll close. And having written several U.S. government documents in the past, I am always loath to do the compare and contrast between one and the other. I used to write the annual report that the Pentagon releases on the Chinese military, and there's always the folks who point out, in this year you said this, and this year you said this, and that always frustrated me. As a caveat, in 2013, Taiwan's QDR lauded the rebalance because it enabled the United States to continue to play a leading role in the Asia Pacific. In 2017, however, that statement changed, saying that U.S. policy, quote, remains to be seen while the rise of China has a tremendous impact on the surrounding regions. And that, to me, when I run that through my universal translator in my brain, points to what I think is a challenge across the region, that all of our allies, our partners, our friends see China continuing to rise, acting more assertively, and having a lot of questions about the future of the United States. I think these questions existed before President Trump. To a degree, they're always present. It was mentioned before in terms of alliance management. There's always the conversation of, will you come to defend us? Yes, we will, yeah, but will you really come to defend us? That's sort of ever present, and I think it was starting to increase. It began to intensify in 2009 after the U.S. financial crisis. Some in China, I think, are still feeling those heady days of 2009 when China was rising and the United States economy was in trouble. But I think they've intensified since the inauguration of President Trump and due to the statements that he's made and the uncertainty about broader American policy, be it economic, military, or political in the Asia Pacific. But overall, I think there's an important balance between continuity and change, and how things come out of the Party Congress, how things come out after the President's trip to the region. If we're able to meet foreign minister to foreign minister, if that is able to happen, I think will tell us a lot about what happens in the next few years in this relationship. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Abe. Very clear and concise. Our final presenter is Ryan Haas, a new colleague here at Brookings. He is the David M. Rubenstein Fellow. He is a part of the John L. Thornton China Center and also has an appointment with my East Asia Center at Brookings. It's great to have him here. He comes to Brookings after 15 years in the Foreign Service, the last 4 years of which we're working night and day in the Asia Directorate of the National Security Council staff, where he spent a lot of time working on Taiwan. So he brings a perspective about U.S.-Taiwan relations that I think will be very useful and valuable. Ryan.
Well, first of all, thank you, Richard, for inviting me to be a part of such a great panel. And thank you to Ambassador Moriarty for such great comments to kick off our conversation today. I had a belated revelation as I was preparing for today's discussion about how much more straightforward it is to talk about Taiwan from a government perspective than it is from a think tank perspective. Government presentations on Taiwan, with the exclusion of Ambassador Moriarty's comments today, follow a comfortably predictable pattern, a usual cadence, talk about the One China policy based upon the Taiwan Relations Act and the 3 joint communiques, with an occasional sprinkling of the 6 assurances, depending upon the circumstances. There's a logic to the predictability of these presentations. What happens on Taiwan matters significantly to American interests. Freelancing is forbidden, and consistency is key. So this consistency, I believe, has enabled a largely underappreciated success story in U.S. foreign policy over the past 40 years. And that is U.S. policy on Taiwan and on cross-strait issues. By and large, the consistency of the U.S. approach has served to protect America's top interests in the region and on Taiwan and on cross-strait issues. These top interests include preserving cross-strait peace and stability, for Taiwan to be strong, confident, and capable of pursuing its interests as it defines them, for Taiwan to be economically vibrant and politically stable, for Taiwan to enjoy dignity and respect on the world stage, for Taiwan to be able to deter coercion, and for close and enduring ties between the people of the United States and the people of Taiwan. And even though it is widely understood among this group, I think it does bear pausing momentarily to reflect on how important the relationship for Taiwan is to the United States and to the people of the United States. Taiwan is our 10th largest trading partner. It's our 7th largest export market for agricultural products. It is the 7th largest source of overseas students studying in American schools. Trade and investment with Taiwan supports over 320,000 jobs in the United States. Taiwan is a leader on environmental and clean energy issues. It is a leader, as Ambassador Moriarty pointed out, on humanitarian issues throughout the world, not just in Asia. It's a top purchaser of US-produced military equipment. And it's a powerful example in a difficult neighborhood of a thriving democracy. Taiwan brings enormous benefits to the United States on its own. None of the success was preordained. While many people are due credit for the progress that has been achieved over the past 40 years, I think that there are two in particular who stand out and deserve a round of applause today. Two of the intellectual architects of our strategy towards Taiwan, and that's Richard Bush and Alan Romberg. So thank you. And while it is appropriate for us to reflect on past accomplishments, I think it is also important for this group to look forward and ask ourselves if we are on track to sustain the success that we have achieved over the past 40 years into the next 40. And frankly, on this question, I worry that there may be insufficient appreciation in Taiwan and in the United States of the amount of effort that will be required to sustain this progress going forward. The challenge in my mind, at the most basic level, is that the three central actors, the mainland, Taiwan, and the United States, have three different narratives of what is happening. And those narratives risk leading the three parties in different directions, with potentially significant consequences for cross-strait peace and stability. I'll start out talking about the narrative that I understand in the mainland, talk a little bit about the narrative I understand in Taiwan, and then close with a few thoughts about how things look from Washington. From Beijing's perspective, Beijing is focused on the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. As an element of this effort, Beijing is focused on making the nation whole again, according to its conception of its territorial boundaries. There are two upcoming centenary celebrations, one in 2021, the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party, and one in 2049, the 100-year anniversary of the People's Republic of China. These two centenary celebrations will focus attention on whether the Communist Party is making progress towards its goals of great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And as a consequence, Beijing's sensitivity over Taiwan will only increase, not just towards opposing formal independence, but likely also towards any semblance of permanent separation of Taiwan from the mainland. I believe we've already begun to see signs of this trend. Over the past year, Beijing has grown increasingly sensitive to what it perceives as de-Sinification in Taiwan. Examples Beijing often cites, and we used to hear in government, and I'm sure our colleagues still do, of grievances from Beijing are revisions to history textbooks in Taiwan, promotion of Aboriginal cultures in Taiwan, a sense of growing Taiwan identity, particularly among the Taiwan youth, that is separate and distinct from the mainland. And these trends have sparked debate inside China, some of which is evident to outside observers, about whether the current strategy that China is pursuing is working and has potential for success, and whether the current strategy will eventually deliver Taiwan back to the mainland. Not coincidentally, Beijing has begun to steadily ratchet up pressure on Taiwan and on President Tsai specifically over the past year. Tools that Beijing has used thus far include reducing numbers of mainland tourists, as Shirley talked about, increasing pressure on Taiwan and multilateral fora, expanding the scope of military activities around Taiwan, not just in the Taiwan Strait, continuing to focus military training and development, including development of doctrine, on the issue of Taiwan, and beginning to poach Taiwan's few remaining diplomatic allies. To be clear, I do not believe that Taiwan's actions to date represent a proximate indicator that Beijing is preparing to use force against Taiwan. Rather, I view them as warning flares, but warning flares that we disregard at our own peril. The message that I take away is that Beijing wants Taiwan and us to understand that its patience is not bottomless, and that it remains determined to achieve unification as part of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. That's the narrative that I see when I look at Beijing. The narrative in Taiwan is different. Based on my conversations in Taipei earlier this month, my sense is that leaders in Taipei look at cross-strait relations from a long-term perspective. They have patience and calm. They do not believe they face an imminent existential threat to their survival. The people of Taiwan have grown conditioned to cross-strait tensions. The population broadly supports sustaining the status quo. There is not popular support in Taiwan in any direction away from the status quo. The KMT, as David mentioned, is a politically weakened force. And as a result, in the current environment, the DPP is the only major political actor on the island. This causes the DPP to have confidence in their position and to believe that they can afford to have patience as long as they don't change the status quo, because ultimately Beijing will have no one else to deal with other than them. At the same time, the DPP is working to advance an agenda that it believes will strengthen Taiwan. Elements of this agenda include bolstering the island's defensive capabilities, modernizing its economy, shifting the island to greater reliance on renewable sources of energy and less reliance on imports, diversifying its trade and investment flows, including through the southbound strategy, and moving the island closer to other major actors, whether it be Japan, the United States, India, Australia, or the EU. So while Taipei believes it is pursuing a prudent hedging strategy that is within the bounds of the cross-strait status quo, Beijing fears Taiwan is distancing itself from the mainland and moving towards permanent separation. This is the difference in narratives that I see between Beijing and Taipei. Now, from Washington's perspective, officials in Washington are concerned about Beijing's intentions, about the limits of Taiwan's capacity to resist coercion, and the risk that Taiwan's dynamism will diminish as Beijing pushes to isolate the island further over time. This leads Washington to encourage Taiwan to feel a sense of urgency, to take steps to make itself stronger and to better defend itself. Washington focuses on issues such as military preparedness, defense budgets, the balance between innovative and asymmetric capabilities versus big-ticket items, and on Taiwan's stubborn refusal to remove impediments that would enable greater cooperation on trade and investment issues, such as beef and pork imports. Washington sees Beijing casting an ever larger shadow over Taiwan and worries that over time the shadow will limit Taiwan's ability to continue to flourish as a healthy, vibrant economy and political entity. And over the past 4+ years, I think that Washington has gained a greater appreciation of the scale of President Xi's ambitions. And this has led some in Washington to worry that Xi may in the future focus more of China's growing power on the question of Taiwan. So to pull this all together, my reading is that Beijing is growing more concerned, Taipei remains quite patient, and Washington is worried both about Beijing becoming impatient and aggressive, and about Taiwan becoming overly complacent. So what to do? Let me start by saying that there are no magic word formulations, no silver bullets that will untangle this challenge. There are, however, a few areas, I think, where additional attention and effort could contribute over time to positively protecting the gains that we've made. I will offer 4 modest proposals, 2 near term and 2 longer term, for the purpose of our subsequent conversation. First, 2 near term proposals. And I think that Ambassador Moriarty has already done this to great effect today, but nevertheless, I think that it may be useful in advance of President Trump's trip to China. for the administration to send a clear and authoritative message to Taipei that our approach to Taiwan and our approach to cross-strait issues is unchanged. We will not entertain a fourth communique, and we will not sacrifice Taiwan's interests in exchange for cooperation from Beijing elsewhere. Second, I strongly encourage President Trump to be forceful when he meets with President Xi in Beijing. I've had the chance to watch President Xi's presentation on Taiwan issues firsthand multiple times. And I believe it'll be important for President Trump to leave President Xi with a clear, unambiguous understanding of the United States' strong, enduring, unchanged commitment to Taiwan and to cross-strait issues. This will help set expectations in Beijing as they relate to cross-strait issues for the years to come. President Trump's meeting in private with President Xi is an important opportunity to lay down a very clear marker. Over the longer term, I think that Washington and Taipei should commit to elevating the level of ambition in the bilateral relationship. There are many areas where the United States and Taiwan share common interests. Both sides, I hope, over time will become more creative and proactive in finding ways to launch initiatives that advance those interests and strengthen habits of cooperation between Washington and Taipei. I think the International Environmental Program, the Global Training and Cooperation Framework provide useful models, as does the deepening U.S.-Taiwan military-to-military training and exchanges. And I hope that we build on those examples over time. And the last modest idea that I will leave you with is a hope that leaders in Taipei remain disciplined about preserving bipartisan support in Washington for Taiwan and about prioritizing Taiwan's strategic interest in close U.S.-Taiwan relations over short-term domestic political point scoring. To be sure, this is not an exhaustive list, this is an illustrative list of the types of steps that will help us sustain the progress that we've achieved in the past 40 years for the next 40. The United States has invested considerably in this relationship. The challenge of maintaining this trend will only grow more as the mainland becomes more determined and capable of imposing its will on Taipei. So I believe that consistency and close coordination will be key to demonstrating that the United States and Taiwan maintain both the capacity and the fortitude to build on the gains of the past 40 years into the next. Thank you.
Are we on?
Yeah,
Thank you to Shirley, Dave, Abe, and Ryan. We've just had 4 really substantive, really well-informed presentations. We have little time for questions. Again, the rules are wait for the mic, identify yourself, and keep your question brief. So who would like to go first? Is that Joe Bosco in the back?
Thank you. Abe, that was a wonderful survey of both Chinese capabilities and activities over the last 40 years and the U.S. Response to them. But it seems to me there's a policy disconnect. You expressed confidence that the U.S. has maintained the capability to defend Taiwan under the Taiwan Relations Act, but has not declared an intention to defend Taiwan directly. Obviously, China doubts our commitment to Taiwan, which is why they continue with their military buildup and the kind of focused capabilities you talked about. It seems to me Mr. Haas has offered a partial solution to that, and that is his recommendation that President Trump make it unequivocally clear to President Xi that the U.S. will defend Taiwan. The only caveat I would add to that is that you mentioned it should be done in private. I believe it should be a public declaration in order to have real credibility.
Anybody want to respond to that? Abe, Ryan?
Sure. Thanks, Joe. I don't see a disconnect between those. In fact, that's been the foundation of our approach for almost 40 years. The ability of making a disambiguation between the ability to defend and the commitment to defend. I think that it's important to make it absolutely clear, both in our confidence in our ability and also our willingness to defend Taiwan against Chinese coercion or aggression against Taiwan, which is different than a commitment. There are treaty allies that we have, in which we do have we have stated and clear commitments to defend them. Taiwan is not one of them, which does not mean that we wouldn't defend them, but it does leave the decision to the president should that time come. But I do think it's important to make it absolutely clear, and I completely agree with Ryan, to make it absolutely clear to President Xi, to other leaders in China, both of our confidence in our capability, but also in our determination to defend Taiwan in the case of Chinese aggression. But I also think it's important to allow for that ambiguity to remain for a wide variety of different reasons.
Okay, next question. Back there.
Okay, again, Xin Qiang from Fudan, and now a visiting scholar at the Johns Hopkins. I have a question for Dave. Just now, it's very interesting. I heard you mention Ko-Wen-je, and as a representative of the so-called third-party power in Taiwan. And you mentioned the Shanghai-Taipei two-city forum. I took part in all of the forums in the past several years, and I can see that really during the negotiation process, Ko-Wen-je has displayed great flexibility. I should say much more flexibility than most of the DPP politicians, and that's make the forum can be happened. So I want to know what's your opinion about the future, or the political future of Mr. Ko-Wen-je, especially when KMT is so weak and which cannot be a powerful competitor of the DPP. Thank you.
Well, in this is work.
Here you are.
In the short term, I believe he's going to run for mayor again. And the DPP hasn't made up its policy yet, but it has definitely held open the door to possibly supporting him again. And I think in light of the politics of Taipei, which is that it's a blue stronghold, that it will be in the interests of the DPP to, in fact, support him in that election. So that allows him to get reelected. And conceivably, if he continues to be successful, and he seems to have been learning on the job, the early stumbles he made seem not to be happening with the same frequency, he might conceivably be a potential candidate for the presidency in the future. But that is a long time away, and I think it's too early to make any kind of meaningful comment on that now.
I'll just add to what David said. In fact, this is there's a lot more coverage internationally just the last 2 weeks. You'll find that I was given an interview by Financial Times last week about Ko-Wen-je when I was in Taipei, and I think it's very interesting how if you look at local politicians, whether it's Jokowi or Modi, there's precedents of this sort of the local politician in situations where they can shine more. And I think today's DPP situation with China is so difficult that if you look carefully, and you were there at Ko-Wen-je's performance in Shanghai, he was able to do a lot of things because it was not necessary for him to talk about 92 consensus. Now, the flip side of this is there's the older generation that actually contributed to his popularity dropping are saying that there are signs of Beijing wanting to support him, to divide basically the DPP. The interesting thing is if you ask younger people, everyone you talk to under 30 will tell you that's not true. It's impossible to say, he's being supported by across the strait. But I think he has, if you look at support levels since he became the mayor, for young people, he's been very consistent. And this comes to what David talked about. There's a huge percentage, about 40% that you would call swing voters, who are not very in love with either the green or the blue right now. And for them, having a way out, it's kind of like the Trump it's more similar to Bernie Sanders phenomenon, is hoping that this will be a third way out, perhaps to pave a new way for cross-strait relations. But the real question is, without grassroots support and party organization, is that possible? And as David says, it's still a long way away.
Okay, Garrett?
Hi, Garrett Van der Wees again. I had a comment and a question. Comment on what David said on popularity ratings, approval ratings. Those were indeed driven by domestic issues, as you indicate, going down to about 30%. But I think it is important to point out that the cross-strait relations were still relatively highly rated by the populace in general. What was also driving the popularity ratings was the performance not of Tsai Ing-wen herself, but of Ing-wen. And after the appointment of William Lai, we have seen much higher popularity rating going up to about 45%. So that is really an important point there. The question was to Ryan. You had a number of propositions at the end, and I particularly enjoy your proposition number C, moving to elevate the ambition in US-Taiwan relations. One of the ways to go about that would be to do away with some of the old self-imposed restrictions that we do have on relations with Taiwan. How do you see this moving forward into the future?
Well, it's easy for me to comment on this because I have no role or responsibility in it at the moment. But I actually am of the view that there is still a lot of space left before we hit the ceiling in our ability to cooperate with Taiwan under the existing framework that exists for the relationship. And I also am of the view that it's better to do more and say less, and that there's plenty of space for us to do a lot very productively with Taiwan without needlessly poking or provoking some of the more symbolic issues that could heighten cross-strait tensions and prove detrimental to our interests.
So what Ryan is saying is that these things might be going on, but you wouldn't even know about it. And that would be, the first part of that is a good thing. The second part, not necessarily. Another question? Yes, right.
Hi, my name is Carrie, and I'm from AEI. I have a question. So suppose the negotiation between Washington and Beijing only involves two topics. The first one is the North Korea and nuclear threats, and the other one is Taiwan. And let's forget about the trade between U.S. and China and China and Japan dispute. So I'm just wondering, what do you think is more critical to President Trump and to the U.S. interests?
So between North Korea and Taiwan, what's more important?
Well, this is really a question for other people on the panel, but I think it's a false question. That's not the way the issues will come together in Beijing. I can understand why people in Taiwan are nervous that a president that changes his position almost daily, why this causes uncertainty. But on the other hand, I think there are, if you look at the way the administration has handled relations with Taiwan, and Ambassador Moriarty explained this with eloquence, I think, there's no reason to think, no ability to find examples of where Taiwan's interest has been sacrificed to do something favorable for Beijing. And I think you can find examples of where the administration has moved ahead in things with Taiwan that might have cause trouble with their relations with Taiwan.
Anybody else?
In previous administrations, there's been a real effort not to link issues. The U.S.-China relationship is so complex. At any given day, there are conversations taking place on literally 100 issues. And once you start to weave them together, you end up with a huge knot that's impossible to untangle. And part of the reason why each issue has been handled on its own in the past has been so that we don't fall into this trap where in order to gain progress on one issue, China is able to exact concessions from us on another. And that is frankly why I was uncomfortable when President Trump linked North Korea and trade issues earlier in the administration, because to Beijing's ear, I think, it meant, okay, so we can trade on North Korea. And that leads us down a dangerous path that doesn't serve our interests or the interests that we have in the credibility of our commitments to friends and partners around the world. So I am dubious and uncomfortable with the idea of linking issues for this reason. More broadly, I think that it's possible, and I speak from an experience, to do good work on both sides of the Taiwan Strait at the same time. And the example that I would draw from is early in 2014, the United States had made a decision that we were going to pursue climate cooperation in secret with the Chinese in hopes that when President Obama traveled to Beijing later in the year, we would be able to surprise the world, reset paradigms by showing that the United States and China were on the same side on climate issues. At the same time that we were pursuing that track, Gina McCarthy traveled to Taiwan to launch the International Environmental Program. She happened to be the first cabinet rank official to travel to Taiwan in 14 years. She had a productive visit. President Obama and President Xi surprised the world shoulder to shoulder in Beijing several months later, and both moved forward in parallel. I mention that just to say that we don't need to put ourselves in the position of making these choices. We can do both simultaneously if we do them well.
Thank you. Harry Harding. For those of you who don't know, Harry was once a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. It's always nice to see him back here.
It's always good to be back. Thank you, Richard. I hope this is not an impossibly big question, but I'll ask it anyway. In addition to our oft-stated desire in the United States for peace, stability, peaceful relations across the Taiwan Straits, we've also talked ever since I think the Shanghai Communique of a goal of seeing a peaceful solution to the issue by we used to say the Chinese themselves, now we have to say by both sides. What are the prospects for that? I'll actually engage in a little strategic foresight here. What are the prospects for a peaceful solution? On what time frame, if any? Or is this the best we can hope for? Basically, a status quo that hopefully will be everybody's second choice, but still will be a stable one.
Slightly cosmic question. Anybody want to take a cosmic shot at it?
Whenever I hear questions like that, I always look at Richard.
Well, let me just make it. It's a typically American question, because like our use of the word solution, we're always seeking solutions, even if the problem is not amenable to solutions. I mean, in the last 40 years has really been a question of managing an impossible thing. And the question for the future is that kind of management still going to be possible or not? And I think I share a certain uncertainty about that. Anyone?
Let me take a stab at it. I think part of the obstacle to getting to some kind of solution, which would be worked out by the two sides themselves, is the content of Beijing's original and continuing formula for unification, one country, two systems. You live in Hong Kong half the year, you know how well that's working out there. And it's not hard for people in Taiwan to see the demonstration effect or lack of it. A lot has changed in Taiwan, including the democratization of the political system, but the offer has not changed. I think I understand why Beijing is sticking with it, but I think that they are making it more difficult to achieve the goal that they want. There's another dimension to this, and that is that I think the assumption in China was always, if we could get the circumstances right, we could persuade the people of Taiwan or their leaders or both that unification was a good idea and that we could work out the terms and conditions. I worry that maybe there's less confidence in the power of sweet persuasion. And as I suggested before, the growing attractiveness of something different, intimidation or worse, and that somehow that's the way to bend Taiwan to the mainland's will. I hope my concerns about this are wrong, but you see an evolution in the thinking of at least some people in China in this direction.
Richard, I think if I could, since it's such a cosmic question, it calls for an academic to say something completely implausible. But when I'm in Beijing, I think people in Beijing are just as pessimistic. A lot of observers who are actually contributing to policy in Beijing are concerned as well that their strategy is not working. I think everyone understands it on both sides of the strait. The strategy for the last 30 years has not worked for Beijing and has not really worked for Taiwan because Taiwan is in a high income trap and China has not bailed Taiwan out. So what kind of benefit is China giving Taiwan? I would say, because you're so pessimistic, to provide a little optimism, I say to friends in Beijing, if 30 years Taiwanese young people can all become so Taiwanese, in 30 years surely you can convince them to become Chinese. It's a project that goes both ways because no other country that I've seen can change in 30 years, but obviously you've failed in moving the dial at all. Everything you've done is changing it to go the other way. So I think this is something very important for Beijing, and after the 19th Party Congress, if there's a real will to use soft power and hard power is always part of it, to move Taiwan in a different direction. I think what Richard said is most important. China also has to find a different governance model because the Hong Kong model has not worked. And it's commonly understood that this will not be applied to Taiwan. It's not acceptable. So most of the Taiwan surveys that say young people don't support unification is predicated on today's China. And I think China has the ability to change it. So as I said, Taiwan needs a more inclusive type of leader. It's actually something I would say more to Beijing leaders. If Beijing wants to rise, they have to have a different leadership.
I could chime in, Richard.
Yeah, please.
Just very quickly. I wanted to point out, in my experience, I think U.S. policymakers that I've interacted with have taken that phrase and emphasized a different part than you did, Harry. Your question on what's our vision for the peaceful solution to this issue, peaceful resolution, emphasize the word resolution. Like, what's the resolution? I have, in all my time in government, I have never had a conversation with any government official about how we would like to see this resolved. And I suspect that if you brought 10 American policymakers from different parties, you get 10 different ideas about how this could work. But I have had countless conversations about how to make sure that it's peaceful. And I think that's been the emphasis from an American perspective, not so much on what's the resolution, what's the modality and all this, but how do we make it peaceful? The way I would put it in my last job in the Department of Defense is, how do we make sure that military planners and the PLA would look at the situation and say, today's not the day. I'm not going to be successful today. Let's put this off. And I think that's been the focus, not so much on the resolution, but the peaceful part.
Last question in the back. Yes, Dave Keegan.
Hi, Dave Keegan. I want to ask sort of a pessimistic complement to that question, and that is, several of you talked about coercion and different forms of coercion, and we talked about the Taiwan Relations Act and our obligations under that. And we can imagine a situation where a missile flies and we say, yep, balloon went up, we do something. But we're seeing the PRC now, it seems, move more in a direction of what I'd call incremental salami slicing, economic and social and international coercion that may in the longer term get to the same place less directly. At what point and how would we intervene? What is the role for us in that kind of very murky, coercive process? I'd appreciate your thoughts.
Anybody?
Maybe I could throw out to add to the question so that you could answer it. I don't have the answer, but I've been participating in a few summits with CEOs, and there is not one Taiwanese CEO who operates in the mainland who is not under some kind of coercion. Nobody will talk about it publicly, but if you ask personally, the experience is common. So I think the salami slicing is extremely clear in low levels, in economic activities. Tourism is nothing but the surface of it, because tourism spending in Taiwan by Chinese tourists is quite low per person. But if you look at large corporations operating, and this kind of pressure is just building up. And I think that I add to his question. What do you think the end result will be?
Yeah, if I could, my take on it. When I was a political appointee in the Obama administration, I would often be asked, how will the president react if this happens or if that happens? And I never answered the question, because I could not speak for the president. I could not say, this is how he would react. So if I couldn't say that for the guy I was working for, I certainly couldn't say that now. And that's always true. It's the decision about how to act is such a personal decision, contingent on such a wide variety of variables, that anybody who says, I know how the president's going to react, is lying, or they're the president. So the question is, and I think the question that you're getting to is, what's the breaking point? What's the tipping point of all this? And again, I think that point is again very subjective and very personalized. But I think it's a much complex, and I think you're right to point out that it's a much more complex question than, oh, there's a missile going off. And I think if you look at the QDR that I mentioned before, when they talk about multi-domain deterrence, it's a recognition that it's a much more complex issue than there's a missile or a bunch of missiles. There's cyber, there's economic coercion, there's a wide variety of different tools. And how people salami slice that, I think, is going to be very personalized. Speaking personally, I think when it starts to fundamentally undermine the political and economic system of Taiwan, then you're starting to get close to that tipping point, to my mind. But again, nobody's going to be able to say definitively what that is. In terms of responses, there's a lot of different ways that we can work with Taiwan on this, and I agree with Ryan in terms of enhancing the ambition, in terms of cooperation on issues as varied as economic cooperation, as cybersecurity, et cetera, et cetera. But it comes down to that fundamental decision about enhancing our ambition and both sides sort of lowering the barriers that have prevented us from doing those things before.
Maybe I could please add a comment. You never know how these things are going to arise in a real world. But I think one principle that the U.S. can follow is to first consult with Taiwan. Because ultimately, in dealing with all of these problems, the first responsibility is Taiwanese. And our role, assuming we still have a government in Taipei that is committed to maintaining stability in the Strait and is not trying to provoke a confrontation with the PRC, our role was to try and support and help them in the face of the coercion that we want to discourage. And I don't see how you can deal, with this coercion comes in all different ways. What should we do if there's a story about another ally about to fall off. How supportive should we be to Taiwan in those circumstances? If Beijing is about to cut off trade relations in some way with Taiwan, what do we do in response? I'm not predicting that Beijing's going to do anything. I think it's entirely possible after the 19th Party Congress that Beijing will take new economic initiatives towards Taiwan.
We moved into a sort of pessimistic direction, but I think it's important to take away from this discussion the basic soundness of the U.S.-Taiwan relationship and the many different ways in which we interact with Taiwan for our shared interests. I think the communication that Dave just mentioned is a very important part of that, and we have a lot of talented people in both governments who are doing it. We also heard reassurance concerning this idea of some sort of grand bargain between the United States and China about Taiwan or involving Taiwan. I agree with that. There's a lot of reasons to follow this closely, and our panelists have helped us do that. But we don't start from a bad place. So thank you all for coming. Please join me in thanking our panelists.